All right, so let's take a look at the next section here. So we've moved beyond skepticism, and something that's very related to skepticism is what McInerney calls agnosticism, or an evasive agnostic attitude, as I like to think of it. And this view says that we cannot come to the truth, right? That we as human beings are just unable to come to the truth. And what McInerney says is that what this really amounts to is people who are unable or unwilling to, basically people who are unwilling to sort of look into a particular matter, right? So these are all kind of related, although skepticism sort of takes a stronger stance into that actually goes about the work of disproving the various positions, right, that are coming towards them, right? It does that work. What agnosticism does is it just says, I'm not even going to worry about that, right? I'm not even going to like sort of take the time because it's not worth it, right? We can't come to truth, and so I'm not going to sort of move forward. Now, when we initially enter into sort of an arena, right? When we initially enter into a particular sort of sphere of knowledge. So let's say that you're just beginning to sort of look into a particular set of political candidates, okay? And so let's say maybe you're looking ahead to the presidential campaign, and you're trying to decide which of the various primary candidates are the most sort of the best candidates, okay? But let's say you haven't been really paying attention to it, and someone says, oh well, you should really support so and so. Now I think it's perfectly acceptable to take this agnostic attitude right at the beginning, but it's not something that one should hold indefinitely, right? Rather, it's something that should be held temporarily until the positions are understood better. So that's the evasive agnostic attitude. Okay, and then we have the cynicism and optimism, right? The cynicism, is this sort of like, even though there's a sufficient amount of evidence, right? You're like, well, I'm not quite sure, and I think we all sort of know what this is like, that we've all sort of seen this. So this type of position, this type of attitude, just never, or not never, right? But just always seems to require additional evidence when it seems to be unreasonable to need additional evidence. And sometimes this sort of has to do with a certain sort of class of positions that someone might hold. And naive optimism, right? Just exactly the opposite. Just that you're very positive about particular positions without sufficient evidence, right? Then think of this as sort of political stuff, right? Where whatever your sort of your political heroes or those that you are most sympathetic to, you might without really listening to the evidence that's given, you might sort of accept their position, right? Or if it's sort of your political foe, you might reject their position. Even if they've provided sufficient evidence. So these are the cynics and the optimists. Okay. And then we have narrow-mindedness. And basically the point here is that we need to have, and I think all of these are actually forms of narrow-mindedness, right? All these things that we've been talking about, but specifically, what narrow-mindedness tends to do is it tends to overly focus us, and it allows us to use non-rational methods of of persuasion, or be persuaded by non-rational methods of persuasion, but not be open to rational methods of persuasion. In order for us to be decent critical thinkers, and it's really important that we are open-minded. This is I'm probably just sort of blabbing on about something that you all already know, but I think it's just important to remember that really what a lot of this has to do with is to remain open. Even if you hold a position, right, and you think that there is sufficient evidence, it's important to remain open-minded to other positions that might pop up. So that's the narrow-mindedness, and that's part of the reason why I assigned this second assignment that you'll be seeing, where I have you, right, sort of take the opposite position from your first week's paper, and you need to sort of look at the opposite side and sort of see what both sides of an issue sort of look like. Okay. And then finally, emotions. So I want to look at emotions here, and we're gonna talk a lot about emotions in the second half of the course. But how are emotions and reason, how are they related to one another, right? So how do they sort of fit together or not fit together? Are emotions always irrational, right? Or are they sometimes the most rational response that we need to take in a given situation? And I think if we think about different emotions, right? You think of fear, right? Fear is really helpful during certain circumstances, but then it can also make us freeze when we need to act in other circumstances. And so when we look at something like fear, right? It's not straightforward whether it's an irrational, a non-rational, or a rational sort of emotion, right? Because I personally, don't want to do without my emotions. And although sometimes sort of letting emotions get in the way can cause problems for the critical thinker, right? If we allow ourselves to be properly guided by our emotions when our emotions have been given their appropriate sort of place, I think they're incredibly useful, and to develop certain habits around our emotions that allow us to respond right correctly at the right sorts of times, such as skepticism, right? Sort of skepticism can be an emotional response, right? When we run into something that needs a skeptical response, right? We might have a certain sort of guardedness that sort of comes up, right? Where we are skeptical in certain circumstances, and I think that's very appropriate. And I think it's emotions that tell us when we should sort of pay attention. Another thing to look at in terms of emotions, and this is slide 12, is David Hume says that our ethics are grounded on emotions, right? That what it means to be ethical is to have a certain type of empathy, and when we see someone else in pain, we empathize with that person, and we sort of can feel where they're at, and so we try to respond, and so emotions perhaps play an important sort of ethical role, and so that's something to look at. Finally, just to bring us back to where we started on slide 13, argue to argue, right? So just again, thinking about what our goal is, and if our goal is truth, right, it doesn't make sense to argue just to argue, right? And if our goal is truth, continuing to argue, even when appropriate evidence has been provided, or right when another person is not likely going to be persuaded by our argument, it kind of doesn't make sense, and can actually be harmful, right, detrimental. And so those are just some of the again, as McInerney sort of mentions, those are some of the various sources, right? Of illogical thinking, the sort of mindsets that we might have. We're going to look at some others when we get to bias and stereotyping and those sorts of things, because those are also really important. But I wanted to sort of start with these because I think it helps us, get a grounding before we move into the fallacies, because the fallacies, when we start to look at these particular fallacies, what they're doing is they're playing on certain of these sources of illogical thinking. So we'll talk about fallacies next time, and that'll be a longer lecture. And so after that, I'll probably do the history section, and then bring up the definition stuff that I was supposed to talk about last week. So thanks for listening.